Let's talk about the 7 hardest things to do while leading worship. Coming in on the list at number 1 is memorizing your music. I know that people struggle with this, and I get that it's difficult. But there is a solution, so fret not. First of all, I'll link some helpful resources really for all of these things that I'm about to talk about down in the description below. But I made a video a while ago about an extensive in-depth video about how to memorize your music. So check that out down in the description below. But when it comes to memorizing your music, the simple solution is to realize that there are patterns in music and that you don't have to memorize each individual chord, but you instead recognize that there are chord progressions that are similar throughout the entire song, and you memorize those. So for instance, let's say verse 1, the chords are G, C, D, E minor. And as we know, worship songs repeat a lot. So you say, okay, the first verse, G, C, D, E minor, G, C, D, E minor, G, C, D, E minor, over and over again. You don't have to memorize each of those individual chords. So you've already whittled it down from 4 chord progressions, so that'd be 16 chords, down to 4 chords. Boom. We've already done a quarter of the work to memorize this, but apply that to verse 2 as well, and now you've taken, 16 chords in the first one, so 32 chords between verse 1 and verse 2, and you shrink that to 4 chords, and now you've done 1/8 of the work. You see how it becomes a lot easier to memorize chords in that case? So start recognizing that there are patterns in music, and don't just think I need to memorize each individual chord. Now, when it comes to lyrics, that one's a little bit harder, but once again, we can memorize things in sections. There are lyrics that repeat. So we look at a lyric sheet and we see this huge list of lyrics and we're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to memorize all those words? But if you break it down into chunks, you realize that the chorus is repeating multiple times. You realize that the bridge repeats 4 times and it's just the same lyrics over and over again. So there is, once again, the ability to break down things into smaller chunks, and you don't have to memorize each word for word. You just have to memorize the different parts of the song. So that's the first thing. But when it comes to memorizing lyrics as well, it helps to actually understand the song that you're singing. If a song is well written, there is a logical flow, not just musically, but a logical flow in thought throughout the song. And I've used the song Another in the Fire by Hillsong before, where it talks about there was another in the fire, and then the next chorus is there is another in the fire, and then the final chorus is there will be another in the fire. There'll be another in the fire, something like that. I haven't done that song in a long time. But my point is, the first verse deals with things that happened in the past. The second verse that you're going to sing deals with things that happen in the present, and the third verse that you're going to sing deals with things that are happening in the future. And so when you understand the past, present, future flow of that song, it helps you memorize the actual lyrics, because you're not just starting from zero, because you know the first verse is something that's happened in the past. And so first of all, the content of the first verse is going to be things that happened in the past, and the word in the first chorus is going to be was, because was talks about the past. The second verse is going to be things that are happening right now. The word in the chorus is going to be is, because it is something that is currently happening. And verse 3 is going to be looking towards the future. And so the word in chorus 3 is will, because it's going to happen in the future. That's just a small example of memorizing a song in that way, but I hope you see that there are logical flows to songs. So don't be overwhelmed by the chords, the amount of chords, or the amount of words. Break it down, think about it critically, and you will be able to memorize music. Also, the more you do it, the easier it will get, just like with anything in life. So if you start, and I guarantee if you made the commitment not to memorize every song from here until eternity, but just to sit down and memorize 4 songs, I bet the 5th song would be infinitely easier to memorize than those first 4 songs. So maybe just try that. Maybe say, I'm going to memorize 4 songs. The second hardest thing to do while leading worship is speaking between songs. Do you struggle to speak between songs? It's not easy. Why? Probably because public speaking is one of the biggest fears of people, right? And that's pretty much public speaking. But I want to help you do it because it's not as difficult as you think if you take this little thing right here and open it up. This could be your speaking between songs. This is a great starting point, is to pick a relevant Bible verse, something that will lead your church in worship. And if you've never spoken between a song before, open up your Bible and read it. That is a great starting point. Now, I do think that we can move, I wouldn't say beyond that because we always want to read the Bible in our services, but I think that we can improve upon that by not just reading a random Bible verse, but actually leading our people in responding to it. And so for that, I want you to ask yourself these 4 questions. I've talked about this before. Where are we going? How are we getting there? What does my church need to know? And what does my church need to do? Let's break those 4 questions down. First of all, where are we going? Think about what your pastor is preaching on Sunday. Think about the overall theme of your service. What are you trying to accomplish? What is the main point of what you're trying to express in your worship service? From there, how are we getting there? Now think of the logistics. What is going to happen to get from people walking in your door to them hearing the message that your pastor has for that specific day? And what is happening all in between? Number 3, what does my church need to know? And this is where the speaking part comes in. Those first 2 questions were just for you to think through the service order in your mind and give you a general direction. But now, what does my church need to know? Your church doesn't need to know everything at once. They just need to know enough to get to the next part of the service. So maybe your church needs to know that you're going to sing Another in the Fire coming up, since I already used that example in this video. Maybe they need to know we're going to be singing about how God is with us through all circumstances. You can point to a relevant Bible verse and let them know that God is with us at all times. He is preserving his church for his glory. And then, and this is the question that you don't want to miss, is what does my church need to do? Because it's not just information. We want to lead people into responding to God. A worship leader is someone who points people to the worthiness of God and provides the opportunity to respond. So don't just point them to the worthiness of God. That's a great starting point. You should definitely do that, but also lead them in responding to his worthiness. So that is when you would say things like, so as we sing this next song, I want you to sing these words over the situation that you're in, believing that they are true, that no matter what you're walking through, no matter where you're at, God is right there in the middle of it with you. The third most difficult thing to do while leading worship are musical transitions. I've got a more in-depth video about this one. Like I said, I think I do for all of these points. So I'll link as many helpful resources down in the description below. But when it comes to musical transitions and musically transitioning between songs, it's difficult, right? And this is what I want you to know, is that we way often overthink this. What is the 20% of musical transitions that will get us 80% of the results? In other words, what is the simplest thing that we can do that will create a good musical transition? And it's simply this. It is eliminating dead air. That's really all you have to do to have a decent musical transition. Now, obviously, you can put songs in similar keys. You can modulate between keys. You can switch off between a female vocalist and a male vocalist. And all of those things are great, which is why I linked the video talking about all of it down in the description below. But if you want a simple fix, just focus on eliminating the dead air. Think, how can I smoothly transition logistically between this song that is in the key of A and this song that is in the key of E? If you just think through, how do I shrink the awkward moment of silence as much as possible, which, by the way, in some case, we can shrink it completely and it's not even there, that is a great musical transition. And it doesn't really matter if you're switching between the key of E and the key of A, or if you're flowing from one song in the key of E to the next song in the key of E. Don't overthink it. Just shrink that awkward moment of silence as much as possible, and that is 80% of the battle. And you will create a pretty decent musical transition. Just be intentional about your musical transitions. Eliminate as much dead air as possible. Number 4, have you ever been here? Has it ever been difficult to lead worship when you're just not feeling it? Did you ever have one of those Sundays where you just come to church and maybe you're feeling a little bit sick, or maybe it's been a rough week, or maybe it's been a rough morning, and you just think to yourself, I would rather not lead worship right now. Let's just be honest, that happens sometimes, right? I mean, if we're leading worship 48 Sundays out of the year, not every Sunday we're going to feel like leading worship. Just like I don't always feel like having my personal devotional time with God, reading my Bible. Let's be honest, right? Like, we can be honest with each other. We don't always feel like doing those things, but the good news is that if we want to exercise our faith, we don't just do things when we feel like doing them. Of course, we want to be joyful when we worship God. We want to be enthusiastic about it. But I think that God also values our obedience. And I know that the counter argument to this is like God sees our heart. And I fully believe that. I believe that God wants our heart in worship. He says, away with your noisy songs and your sacrifices. I don't want them. They smell like garbage to me because your hearts aren't right. But I think that there is room for us to say, I just don't feel like doing this right now, but I've decided in advance that it is true, that it is good for my soul. And so, God, I want you to shape my affections to want to worship you and to want to lead your church in this moment, or to want to read my Bible in this moment. But I'm being honest, I don't feel it right now. And so until I have those affections, I am going to do those things anyways. I'm not going to wait until I feel like doing it. I'm just going to do it because I have decided in advance, and I know intellectually, not just with my feelings, which I hope that they get there eventually, that my affections match what my mind believes. But until that happens, I'm going to worship you anyways. Isn't that a lot more powerful until waiting until we feel like doing something? If I waited until I felt like reading my Bible, I wouldn't read my Bible every morning, because sometimes I wake up in the morning and I don't feel like reading my Bible. But I do it anyways. And some other mornings I wake up and I feel like reading my Bible, and it's amazing because my feelings match what I know is true and what is best for me. So how do you overcome this difficult situation of leading worship when you don't feel like it? You don't just back away and say, I don't feel like leading worship today, so I'm not going to do it. You do it anyways because you know that God is worthy, and you ask and pray that God would shape your intentions, shape your attitude, shape your affections to match what you know is true, and then you do it anyways because you know that even if you don't feel like it, it is still the best thing for you to do because we were created to worship. And so worshiping God, whether we feel like it or not all the time, is always the best thing that we can do. How about this one? Finding volunteers. Do you have enough people on your worship team, or do you wish that there were more? I think we all wish that there were more, right? Whether it's just you leading on a Sunday morning, even if you have 10 people on your worship team, you probably want more volunteers. But if you haven't noticed, it's really hard to get people to join your worship team. You don't necessarily just have this line of people signing up to join your worship team, right? That would be amazing, because then you could have like 4 people in each role and everybody could lead once a month and it would be amazing, right? It's difficult to find volunteers. Here are a couple things you can do. Number 1, make a list of 5 people that you can ask in your church. Do not discriminate in your mind. I'm not talking about looking at people and being like, they wouldn't work because of this. I'm talking about looking at people and being like, this person has potential to be on the worship team. I don't need to think through all of the different circumstances before I ask them to join my team. I don't need to say no for them in advance. I don't need to say, they just had a kid and they're going to be busy with that, and so I'm not going to ask them. I don't need to think, they're busy with another ministry over here, so they wouldn't want to be interested in being on the worship team. Just make a list of 5 people. You can probably, depending on the size of your church, you can probably find 5 people. Even in a church of 100 people, you can sit down and write down a list of 5 people. And then, if you want to find volunteers, you don't just put a slide up on the screen on Sunday and say, if you want to join the worship team, talk to whoever after the service. But you actually go and ask them. That's why we made the list of 5 people, because we're going to go and ask them and say, hey, I was thinking, we're trying to find some more people for the worship team, and I don't know if this is a good fit for you or not, but you came to mind for some reason. So is that something that you would be interested in pursuing? And probably one of those 5 people will say yes. But guess what? Now you have one more volunteer on your team who wasn't on the team before. And so to overcome the finding volunteer problem, instead of just complaining about it, if we actually want to find more volunteers, then we go and ask people if they want to join the team. Now, in relation to finding volunteers, the 6th hardest thing to do when leading worship or when leading a worship ministry is telling people no to being on the worship team. That's difficult, right? Have you ever had to tell somebody no to being on your worship team? It's not something that we want to say, and so sometimes we don't say it at all because it's too difficult, and then we welcome a person who's not gifted musically or who is going to be a problem on our team, and we do it all because we're afraid to say no, because it's difficult to say no. So how do you say no to somebody who wants to join your worship team? I get this question from people all the time, and here are my thoughts. First of all, my default response, if the answer isn't yes to being on the worship team, usually isn't no. It is not yet. I will tell the person, I'd love for you to join the team, but I don't think that you're quite ready yet. Telling them that there's a chance in the future for them to join the team. And then I don't just leave it there. I give them specific things that they need to work on if they want to join the worship team. I say, in your audition, you were really flat in a couple parts. And so if you can just work on getting in tune, in pitch, that's what needs to happen before you can join the worship team. Or a guitarist comes and plays and fumbles through the chords and said, you're still a little bit sloppy in those chord transitions, and I feel like you're just not quite there yet to play regularly on a Sunday, but I would love for you to work on those chord changes and come back in 3 months and we can try an audition again. See how that's a lot different than, nope, you're not ready to join the worship team. Thanks for trying out, but we don't need you. That's why people are afraid to say no, because they should say not yet instead of saying no. Now, sometimes you do need to say no, and these are for the most egregious cases, right? Like these, I think I would probably only say no for like a moral issue. I would always give a person the opportunity to improve musically, I think, and tell them to come back in 3 months. And so usually I give the answer not yet. The only reason I would say no is for if they didn't live up to the code of conduct that I have for my team. Now, the problem is a lot of people don't have a code of conduct, or they don't know what their worship team members should be living up to. And that's why I've linked down in the description below the worship team toolkit. In that, I will give you the exact word for word copy and paste template for the code of conduct that I put together for my team, and also give you the application form that I used for my team. So check that out, the worship team toolkit, down in the description below. But you have to have these things in place so that when somebody comes to your team, first of all, you've communicated clearly to them what the expectations of a worship team member are. But secondly, you have to know what those expectations are so that you can compare potential team members to what you want your worship team members to be. And not that they have to be these perfect people, but there are certain things that disqualify people from public ministry. And so have you identified those things? And then when you say no, if you have to say no because of that, and you don't just say not yet, if you have to say no, then you are very clear with them. And you say, hey, we believe that if you're on the worship team, you shouldn't be using drugs. Let's use that example. That seems like an obvious example. We believe that you shouldn't be using drugs. We notice that you have a habit of using marijuana consistently or at all. And as per our code of conduct, we don't allow that on our team. And so unless you work through that, and we would love to walk alongside you as you work through that. We think it's best for you to not lead worship at this time. That way, you tell them very clearly, and it's not like this ambiguous thing where all these people must just hate me for no reason. First of all, we don't hate you, but there is a reason that you can't join the worship team. So be very clear in your no answer. And number 7, the most difficult thing to do while leading worship is to not lead worship, to take a day off. Do you find that to be true? Is it difficult to take a week off? Sometimes it feels like, first of all, nobody can fill in for you, right? There's nobody else that can do what I can do. Or maybe it feels like it takes more work to take a week off than it is to just show up and lead worship. I know that I've felt that way before because there's so many things that you have to do in advance. Here's how we fix it. First of all, we recognize that we are important, but we are not that important. If you are away for a Sunday, your church is not going to fall apart. You aren't going to come back to your church the next week after your week off, and it is going to be burnt to the ground, and the flock will have abandoned the church. That's not going to happen. So I think that maybe we don't necessarily think those things specifically, but I think that's kind of where our thought process goes towards. Or if I don't show up, the sound is going to be horrible and there's going to be this horrible tech problem and nobody else in the church is going to be able to fix it. Guess what? If you're not there and you're unavailable, somebody's going to step up, or they're going to find a different solution and just not use wireless microphones that day, right? You are important, but you aren't that important. So don't make yourself the cornerstone of the church. Jesus is the cornerstone of the church. So the first thing to overcome this is a mindset thing, that we have to understand that we are important, but we aren't that important. Number 2, we have to put in the work in advance. You can't just decide one Sunday that you're going to take off and everything's going to be okay. If you've never taken a Sunday off before, or if you rarely take a Sunday off. Now, I think you can work to that point eventually, but if you've never done that before, then we need to put in a little work beforehand to get to that point. And so what that looks like is raising up leaders in your church. Do you have somebody who can lead in your place on Sunday morning? If not, identify somebody and start pouring into them so that in 6 months they can get to that place. Maybe you think, okay, I don't have anybody who leads with me on Sunday. Like, it's literally just me. I don't have anybody to pour into. Well, then look outside of your church and find somebody who can come in and fill in for you for that Sunday. Work with your pastor to come up with a different solution for a Sunday. But there is really no reason that you can't take off at least 2, preferably 4 Sundays a year. Your church will survive without you for 4 weeks during the year. Now, if you want to take action on one of these difficult things right now, I think the best one is to start thinking through what you want out of a worship team member, and that's why I linked down in the description below the worship team toolkit. In that, I will give you a copy and paste template, the exact document that I use for my code of conduct. It's called the Worship Team Toolkit. I've linked it down in the description below. Also, in that toolkit, there is the application form that I give to new worship team members who fill that out before they join my worship team, so that I get to know them better and kind of go through the filtering process so that I have to say no a lot less often and I can say yes and not yet more. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.